for me to be with you. I wish at some point after we get out of this COVID, I can be in person, because I'm really interested, you know, in going to Guyana. It's also a pleasure to be joined by my friend and colleague Todd, who has been developing innovative ideas about how to deal with issues regarding oil wealth management, resource wealth management for probably more than a decade now, that I think are very important to pay attention to, and in which I have been also a participant. So, of course, you know that the case of Guyana will be a very special case in the history of the sort of oil wealth management. You know, I've been studying this issue for almost 2 decades. I've been teaching a course on the politics and economics of both the oil sector itself, but also oil wealth management and sort of the political institutional effects. And there haven't been in recent years that many countries that will go from not producing any oil and for being relatively having relatively low wealth to become the country with the highest potentially per capita oil production on Earth, more than Kuwait, which is currently the country that has the highest production per capita. So that's a pretty remarkable development, and of course offers tremendous opportunities for the country and the people of Guyana, but also some significant challenges. To give you an idea, Venezuela, the country where I was born, at its peak produced in per capita terms less than half of what Guyana is probably going to produce if Exxon and their partners, you know, get to the levels that they are predicting. And that was in the 1950s, when Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America. And in fact, it was among the wealthiest countries on Earth at the time in per capita terms. So, so it's pretty remarkable what we are going to witness in Guyana. And keep in mind that that era of super wealth in Venezuela was prompted when the country had relatively low royalties and taxes for the oil industry at the time, and the price of oil was, of course, in real terms lower than what we're witnessing today. So this is a big story for, of course, for you, the people of Guyana, but also for those of us who study this issue. So the basic idea, I think, I mean, you had my friend Michael Ross here in the past, and so you have heard a lot of the issues about the resource course, but I want to give you a little bit of my take. The first point I want to make is that oil is not a curse in the sense of you are not better off most of the time. There are very few cases in the world that you could argue that you are worse off discovering oil than what you would have been if you hadn't discovered oil, right? And even countries like Venezuela, which is today a basket case, you know, for 60 years enjoyed tremendous benefits and blessings from discovering oil. Having said that, you know, it is true that it generates tremendous traps, challenges, pitfalls, whatever you want to call them, that could really derail the country, that could have negative political and economic consequences. And in almost all cases, I think, probably with the exception of Norway, it is in part a wasted opportunity, in the sense that if you see what countries actually do with and compare it to the counterfactual or what they could have done, for example, in terms of investment in both physical and human capital, and in terms of saving for future generations, usually the performance is significantly worse than that sort of ideal counterfactual. And and in some periods, particularly, the hardest thing to manage is volatility. Is the volatility of income and the price of oil. And you can see, for example, a country like Botswana that has been one of the most successful resource-based countries in the world. Well, they have much less volatility because the diamond market is less volatile than oil. And so they have been tremendously successful in doing all the things, but they also had a less challenging sort of volatility to begin with, right? So the other thing is that abundance, having a lot of oil per capita is not a problem. I mean, the problem is depending on it, right? To give you an idea, the United States has more oil production per capita and more oil reserves per capita than Nigeria. So it's wealthier in terms of oil, but it's not dependent at all of the oil industry. And as a result, it doesn't have the problematic effects. So of course, in the case of Guyana, it's inevitable that you will be dependent on oil. To give you an idea, Norway is dependent on oil in the strict sense that a lot of its income and exports come from oil. Of course, they save them all, most of them. So in reality, the actual economy is not in that sense dependent, but they are dependent if you use a traditional sort of definition, right? So, by the way, even Norway, which is sort of the outlier, as I said, there are very few countries that you could argue they would have been better off if they hadn't discovered oil. Even, horrible cases like Equatorial Guinea or Nigeria or Venezuela today. I don't think it's easy to make that argument. But of course, compared to what it could be, they are horrible cases. In the other extreme, you have Norway. That is, of course, a spectacular case. But even Norway, it took them 2 decades to start to save money in their fund and to really get to a set of policies that made it as successful as they are now. They had to struggle with it. And if the Norwegians, which have more than 100 years of institutional tradition and democracy, etc., had trouble dealing with this. By the way, they sent in the 1980s a mission to Venezuela to study how not to do it, and the Venezuelans were a bit upset by that. But they learn from others' mistakes, right? So, about the challenges. First, there are the challenges of actually developing the sector itself, because we might think that it's granted that the sector it will be developed, and it will develop in a way that actually benefits the country. But that's not, of course, necessarily granted. The first issue is that sometimes you have ineffective contracts and taxation systems and frameworks that are either, for example, not progressive in the sense that when the companies make much more money because either the price of oil goes up or they make discoveries that are very profitable, the government doesn't get like a larger share of the pie. You also have, and that is challenging. Of course, ideally, if you do it starting now, for example, you will want to do, for example, bidding rounds to so that the government take is finally sort of decided in a competitive bid. But that requires a lot of institution building and the like. The history of the region in Latin America has had a lot of bad examples of potential not developed because of these cycles of investment and changing the rules, expropriations in the region. For example, countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, or Argentina have had multiple cancellation of contracts, forceful renegotiation of contracts and the like that have led to much less investment than would otherwise happen. Even the countries that have been more respectful of property rights, like Brazil and Colombia in the region, had in the period of oil boom, high prices, etc., or big discoveries, like the pre-salt in Brazil, had become to sort of, you know, believe that they are rich and that they can do whatever they want with the oil sector. And even though they haven't renegotiated contracts back in a way that created, I'm not saying that you know, that you cannot think about renegotiation, but you have to be very careful about that. It's a, you know, it's a dangerous proposition if you don't do it properly. But in these countries, they didn't do renegotiation of past contracts, but they created new contracts that were basically not competitive, and they delayed dramatically the development of their oil sectors. Of course, you have also some other challenges that are classical. One is, in many countries, an NOC is created that actually becomes more a rent-seeking machine than an actual actor that, you know, generates capacities and helps the country develop. I'm not saying that everywhere. There are some good examples, of course, like Norway, like Petrobras in Brazil, despite its recent scandals. Also, local content policy, which is, of course, something that could be helpful for development of the country, could end up being just a rent-seeking opportunity for local crony capitalists, and therefore just taking some of the rents generated by the oil sector and putting them in their pockets rather than, you know, generating economic development. So these things are tricky and have to be done properly. Finally, one terrible idea that almost every single major oil producer has sort of done at some point, is the idea of massively subsidizing energy in their country, particularly, you know, like your neighbor Venezuela, that basically gave away gasoline for free for many years. That's one of the worst public policies, and if you want, we can talk a little bit more later. Really bad idea to do that. The economic challenges, of course, you know many of them. As I said, volatility is one of the hardest things to manage. Usually, if you see the growth rate of countries that are oil dependent, the problem, of course, is not when the prices are going up, although they produce some challenges, but when they are going down or they are very volatile, because, you know, it's very hard to manage that volatility in your income. It was hard for Norway, imagine, for a less developed country. And of course, it's very hard to have counter-cyclical fiscal policies, which are the ones you need, because, you know, it's really hard to convince people to be prudent during the boom times, and therefore be having the money for them to be, you know, able to be counter-cyclical during the bad times. And so most oil countries end up being pro-cyclical, meaning they exacerbate the booms and then they generate worse recessions than they would have been otherwise. Of course, you have the issue of Dutch disease that makes it very hard to be competitive in other sectors in the economy. You have the issues of rent-seeking and corruption that, of course, are you know, exist in almost all the developing world, and even in the developed world in some places, but they can be exacerbated by the flow of oil money. You can see just next door Venezuela during the oil boom, the massive amounts of graft and money that were stolen during that period. And of course, it's sometimes not just corruption, but you know, rent-seeking. Then you have a challenge that not many other wealthy countries have had in the past, oil wealth, I mean, which is the prospect of obsolescence. You know, it's not in the case of Guyana depletion, because I think you will probably have enough oil to produce a lot of oil for many years. The question, of course, is with climate change and all the energy transition that we're getting into, I mean, you might have a window of opportunity of maybe 2 decades, or maybe at most maybe 3. I mean, it's very hard to know, to predict the future of the energy markets, but, you know, we know that there is a high risk that this is not, so it's not like Venezuela that had 80 years of oil production. This is probably a shorter period of time that you will have to get this right. And that means, I think, that even though Guyana, of course, has to use a lot of the resources because it starts from a situation in which it needs a lot of infrastructure and other things, it also has to be really careful about thinking about the future generations and when this wealth is not as valuable as it is today. Because I think for a long while it might be still, possible to produce, but probably with much lower rent at some point in the future. Finally, the politics of it, the problems that have, the case of Guyana illustrates something that is a big challenge, which is this is to have a democracy and a functional set of institutions, one thing you need is to have stakes of power that are not that big, meaning the following. If being in power means that you have control over all the resources and decide whatever you want to do with them, and being outside of power is really being in a horrible position, and the one in power can stay forever because using the wealth to get reelected, and the one who is outside of power feels that it will never get back to power, that of course generates incentives for a lot of bad behavior. It has generated in other countries in the world violence, attempted coups, populism, the maximization of these political cycles during election times, spending like crazy. So this is something that the political institutions have to address, and it's not easy to address. In particular, it's extremely hard to save when you think the following. You think, instead of saving, I spend, I am more likely to remain in power. And of course, if I spend, I decide where I spend, and that might be in my part of society that supports me. And so if I lose, another one will spend. Even in countries that are very institutionalized, this has been a difficult challenge to actually save the resources. And so it's very difficult to generate stabilization and savings programs that are sustainable. And that is usually made much harder if you have a society that is polarized or ethnically or religiously or other ways divided. Because, of course, in a society in which there are very few cleavages and it's very equal society, very homogeneous society, it doesn't make that much of a difference who is in power. But the more polarization that you have, the least willing you are that the other group is the one controlling the resources. So that makes it even more important for society to have institutions and rules that sort of guarantee everybody, that it's part of the sort of long-term benefits of the wealth. And of course, you have other issues with corruption. Finally, you have the issue of the social contract, and Todd will talk more probably about this. But you have a society that now will, instead the state living from the taxes that people pay, the citizens will be living of the government largesse in some way, even though they are the owners of the wealth, and of course that could lead to some interesting ideas, and so I mean, I'm not an expert at all in your country, in Guyana, but looking from afar, I think this is a constitutional moment in the country, in the sense that you need to really create the basis for a long-term stability in the country that relates to these basic lines about oil development, about how the wealth will be shared, and avoids and how much will be saved, etc., and avoids the pitfalls, because otherwise you might end up in I wouldn't say in a worse place than without discovering oil, but in a much worse place than you could be if you do things right. And so with that, I leave Todd to continue.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Francisco. Thank you, Thomas and Anna. I'm really grateful for the chance to talk to you. I'm really grateful to be online with my friend Francisco. I wish I was in Houston right now, or in Georgetown would be even better with all of you. so Francisco laid out, I think, very well a lot of the challenges that countries like Guyana will face given the situation you're in. Before I turn to some of the solutions, I want to actually just highlight a couple of his points and maybe emphasize them. One is Francisco mentioned Dutch disease. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but I think that the pressure of Dutch disease, where the inflow of dollars is going to make the local currency very, very valuable and overpriced. And the effect of that is that it comes at the cost of every other industry in the country. So anything in agriculture and manufacturing, services, all of a sudden you've made all of those things much more expensive. And what that means is that it's going to really squeeze jobs outside of the oil sector. What's even worse is that the oil and gas industry, it creates a lot of income, but it really does not create very many jobs. So the prospect that Francisco's right, you're better off than you, on the whole, than you would be if this had never happened. But the chances that you're going to have fewer jobs is actually quite a big risk, just because the employment effects can be really, really substantial. The second thing I want to just highlight is Francisco mentioned about politics and how the stakes become much higher. That's absolutely true. It's also that it really, depending how the resource is managed, it can really concentrate power in a very small number of people and give them an incredible amount of leverage over the economy and the country as a whole, which you wouldn't have in a very diversified economy. And then the third point, which will lead to some of the solutions or some of the responses I want to highlight, is really Francisco's excellent point about the social contract. Now, the social contract is sort of theoretical, but it has massive real world effects. So the theory is that there's a bargain between a government and its people. And at its core, the bargain is pretty simple. Citizens pay taxes, and in exchange, the government provides services. And when the government doesn't provide services, you use that lever of taxes to demand better services. But when the government doesn't need taxes anymore, this social contract, the bargaining position of citizens gets severely, severely weakened, and the incentives for the government to collect taxes become severely weakened. Now, this seems kind of obvious, but it's actually, if you think of the oil money as essentially free income for the government did not really do anything to earn that income. It's really just a geological stroke of luck. And yes, yes, you have to get the contracts right and you have to do a few things, but it's not the same as building a diversified agriculture manufacturing base where you then have to go collect taxes. So the government no longer really cares or needs to have a strong incentive to build a diversified base and to extract taxes. On the flip side, it also helps to undermine the means and the incentives for citizens to both pay attention to what the government's doing and to hold the government accountable. So that kind of downward spiral of the social contract is what you hope to try to reverse. Okay, so what are some of the things that Guyana can do to avoid the problems or potential pitfalls of this? Now, I am sure, I think Thomas was telling us a little bit about this, but I'm absolutely certain that you are getting a lot of free advice. And most of the advice is very well-intentioned. And I'm sure people are telling you that what you really need are strong institutions. And everyone will always talk about Norway. I'm glad Francisco talked about Norway. And Norway, you just have to remember that Norway had 150 years of democracy before they found oil. They had strong institutions before the revenues come. And so my entire career has been mostly working in Africa. And so I see this all the time. the Norwegians come and they tell the Nigerians what to do, and they come and tell Ghanaians what to do, and now the Senegalese and the Mozambicans. So, but telling a country like Guyana, and I think I've probably said this to Francisco before, but telling a country like Guyana that they need strong institutions is just like telling someone with insomnia that you've figured out their problem and they need to get more sleep. So it's true, you need strong institutions, but it's not useful advice, right? The useful question is, okay, how does a young country build strong institutions? And the dirty secret in development is that no one actually knows, okay? But there are a lot of things that you can do. While no one can come tell you this is how you build strong institutions, there are things that you can do that can minimize the problems and can help to promote more positive dynamics rather than the negative ones. And one, the first step, of which I'm sure you're being advised often, is to be very transparent. Be transparent about contracts, be transparent about revenues, and be transparent about government spending as much as possible. I'll come back to why that matters. The second is there are these mechanisms that you can try, like a sovereign wealth fund or a special, some kind of special budget vehicle. And what these special funds do, they really can help with three problems. So one is that they can set very clear rules about that everyone can understand about when do you spend and when do you save. Now, Guyana will want to spend because it's a relatively poor country, but it will also want to save, and because you don't want to use all the funds, you want to think about your children and grandchildren. And Francisco is right that you don't know how long this window, this oil window will last. But if you have very clear rules that X% will be spent, X% will be saved, these are the rules that can help. Also, having a sovereign wealth fund where you take the money offshore, you leave it in an account in dollars somewhere else, helps to mitigate that Dutch disease effect. And the other thing that it does is it really, by having a sovereign wealth fund or some structure where you're spending according to a formula, it really does help you save that money for the future, so that you're building assets that could last a long time. Now, and then one other thing that you can do, other than being transparent using a sovereign wealth fund, is that you can find ways to use that income to directly try to counteract the effect on jobs and competitiveness. Now, Francisco is absolutely right that subsidizing energy is something that a lot of countries do, and it almost always gets completely out of control, and it makes things much, much worse. I agree with him that it's a terrible policy almost everywhere. But if you're developing an oil and gas sector at the same time, when the government is negotiating with a big company like Exxon, that is the time you can also ask for other things to add value to the domestic economy. So for example, I don't know the details of Guyana's oil, but instead of flaring associated gas, maybe you can get the company to commit to converting that gas to, I don't know, cooking a gas that could be used. Or maybe, I don't know if this is a good idea, but it's worth thinking about a fertilizer factory from gas. And especially something you can do with gas is burn cheap and reliable electricity. Now, just before we got on the call, I had a look at some of the data, and Guyana has the most expensive electricity in South America, and it has the most unreliable electricity in South America. So that is a terrible combination, especially if you're trying to generate jobs outside of the oil sector. So, you know, I don't know what other sectors might be, you know, I don't know if Guyana could have an IT sector or financial services sector or agriculture. I know sugar is big, but all of those industries rely on cheap, affordable electricity. And if you were able to, I think industrial electricity there is around 33 cents a kilowatt hour, and the reliability looked terrible. I don't know if you have a lot of outages in Georgetown, but if you were trying to compete on an industrial on financial services or IT or something like that, you're going to need electricity that's 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and it has to run all the time, 99% reliability. Now, I'm not saying you could do that for the entire country, but Exxon has built power plants in other countries where they're extracting oil. They don't like to do it. They are not an electricity company, but you might be able to package something where you could provide low-cost, reliable electricity, at least for the capital city. And that would be something where you would be spreading the benefits. Now, not to subsidize the price, because that will actually destroy reliability, but to find, to leverage the resource. And then finally, I just want to mention a kind of big idea that I've been talking about for a little while, which is, if you think of insomnia as the problem, one solution to insomnia is you can do a shortcut, which is take a sleeping pill. So what is the equivalent of a sleeping pill for a country facing an oil boom? It's something that we call oil to cash. And we wrote a short little book, very easy to read. I will, once I stop, I will post the link in the chat, and you can download the book now for free in a PDF from the Center for Global Development's website. And one of the co-authors, Stephanie Majerovic, actually is a political scientist at a university in Bogota, so also in your neighborhood. Now, the idea of oil to cash is built around cash transfers. Cash transfers, which is giving regular cash to people directly, is used around the world throughout Latin America. And they use it to fight poverty. They use it to respond to disasters. They use it to encourage entrepreneurship and human capital. The idea of oil to cash is that you would link this together to the oil revenue. Now, if you think of the resource curse risks, the politics, the economics, and the social contract, you can help to flip the dynamics on all of those by bringing direct economic and political benefits, plus helping to restore the social contract in a way by turning every citizen into a shareholder of that oil and paying every citizen a dividend from that oil income. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of questions, but let me just quickly talk about how this could work. It's kind of a three-step process. One is that when oil revenues come in, you put some of them, whatever the rule is, let's say 30% or something, into a special fund. And everyone knows the resources are in that special fund. Then a portion of that fund would be used to pay every citizen cash. Let's say everyone in the country over 18 receives it 2 times a year. And this could be done very inexpensively. You can use biometric ID with iris scanning or fingerprints, and you can use mobile money so you can audit and trace all the money. So that's step 2. Step 3, and really here's the best part, is that to give everyone in the country cash, you have to build a system where you know every person and you connect that person to a bank account of some kind. That same system, it can also be used for tax collection. So part of the cash transfer, let's say it's $50 US. You could say, okay, everyone gets $50. However, we are going to have a 20% withholding tax, and we're going to keep $10 that goes to the treasury, and you actually only receive 40 of your 50. And over time, you would get everyone inside the tax net, and everyone would be used to paying some form of taxes. And that's how you could help to rebuild a broad tax base where everyone is paying, everyone's receiving an income, everyone's contributing taxes, and you help to start to rebuild that social contract. Now, the benefits of this are pretty substantial. One is that every citizen would immediately see a benefit. You know, in every country I work in Africa that has oil or even mining revenues, I hear people complain that my country is rich and I don't see any benefits. This would help make a very visible benefit. The second, from the government's perspective, giving people cash or transition, you know, being the conduit for people to get cash it actually makes you very popular. So the incentives are quite strong for governments to do this. It also creates positive incentives for the citizens to pay attention to the oil sector. They're going to want to know, did my government sign a good contract? Are we getting enough taxes out of those revenues? Is the money actually that we're, you know, if the money is the money we're supposed to get from Exxon, is that going into the fund or is it disappearing? It creates all kinds of incentives to really pay attention. And then that also creates incentives for the government to actually deliver, because they know that everyone is providing scrutiny. So the way to think about this is that this is a very nice match with the transparency that I talked about earlier, transparency of contracts, of income, and of spending. Because transparency, if you think about it, that is the supply side of good governance. Giving people oil to cash or direct cash benefit from this linked to revenues helps to create demand for good governance. So it helps to create that virtuous cycle. Now, national cash transfers programs linked to some kind of resource revenue are already being done in partially in Bolivia now. It's partially being done in Mongolia. And the country really to look at is India, because India has the world's largest cash transfer program in the world. They use biometric ID, they use mobile money, and what they're actually doing, getting back to Francisco's point about around fossil fuel subsidies being terrible, this program is replacing cooking gas subsidies. They're actually getting rid of subsidies and replacing those with cash in India. So let me just end by saying that your country is both lucky and in some ways unlucky to have discovered oil. You're definitely at this pivotal moment, like Francisco said, where you know the money hasn't started flowing, so you still have time to get the pieces in place. And one of the ways you could help to be less like Equatorial Guinea and maybe a little bit more like Botswana or Norway is by sharing the winnings with all citizens, which would help to put the nation on a path to prosperity, to unity, and to a broader sense of development. So let me stop there, although I will, let me paste the book link here. If anybody wants to have a look at the book for free, you can get it here. There we go.
While you do that, Todd,